I was the first of our people to see the stars. It was the year 12,717, and we thought ourselves civilized. Long past was the age of wars, when Yihante killed Yihante. Our species had developed beyond its primitive roots. We had mastered electricity, built railways and telegraphs that circled the entire world. Our science could explain our world down to the smallest microorganism. We thought ourselves wise. Sometimes we wondered if there were other layers. We live between the earth and the clouds, in a layer of air a few kilometers thick. This would seem to be self-evident, although in antiquity many philosophers thought that the sea should be considered as a separate layer beneath ours. Of course, science revealed that at the bottom of every sea there is more earth, and the sea is simply a bottom section of our layer, rather than a separate one in its own right. But our most creative thinkers continue to wonder whether there were any more layers below the earth and above the clouds. Most of us scarcely gave it much thought, though. Life was busy enough without spending time pondering the nature of the universe. True, the discovery of the magma layer did cause something of a stir, but that had been theorized for a long time. Volcanoes had to be coming from somewhere, and although many scientists held that they were a local phenomenon caused by underground fires, the magma layer hypothesis was well known, and not anything shocking. When it was finally confirmed, there was a brief flurry of public interest, but that soon subsided. After all, it wasn't as if you could actually travel there. The ancient myths spoke of thousands of layers, each holding a different kingdom home to Yihante on different stages of their spiritual journey. Do good in life, and you would ascend to the cloud layer. Fail to abide by the precepts of order, and you will be dragged down into the earth to serve in the kingdom of the damned for a lifetime. As it turned out, instead of being dark and cold, the kingdom of the damned was full of molten rock hot enough to melt glass. Not much opportunity for spiritual purification there. There was still the lingering problem of the day-night cycle. Science had tried to explain it for centuries, and never managed to come up with anything much more convincing than the ancient myths, which spoke of a kingdom of the blessed in the cloud layer, where the shining ones lived. However, the discovery of the magma layer seemed to tip the scales heavily in favour of an earth-based explanation. It was theorized that the convection currents in the magma layer were regular enough to produce the observed day-night cycle, and the glowing clouds were really just the light radiated off the earth being reflected back at us. I was never satisfied with this, however. I had always intuitively leaned towards the cloud layer as the source of the heat, and although I had never been a proponent of the lightning storm hypothesis, I felt there must be some better explanation for day and night than convection currents deep beneath the earth. This wasn't entirely a gut feeling on my part. The magma layer specialists had never been able to make the mathematics add up to anyone's satisfaction. Neither their measurements for how much heat penetrated upwards, nor their modelling of the convection current seemed to hold up to scrutiny. As far as I could see, the field of diurnal studies was still wide open for a paradigm-altering discovery. And I saw no reason why I shouldn't be the one to make that discovery. Of course, at the start, I hadn't the slightest idea what I was taking on, but the same could be said of most great achievements. I'd always been fascinated with the cloud layer, and had made it my business to study it. Of course, unlike the Earth layer, we couldn't drill our way in to take samples. It was mainly based on visual observations when I was a junior scholar, supplemented by collecting and analysing rainwater. The invention of the telegraph was a game-changer, because it allowed us to track weather fronts across thousands of miles and record how they developed. But other than that, there hadn't been any significant advancements in centuries. I, however, thought I could change that. Almost since I'd cracked my way out of my egg, I'd wanted to visit the cloud layer, and in between submitting papers on respectable topics, I'd been working towards making that wild dream a reality. Meteorology was a respected academic field, but flight was the province of crackpots and the overly religious. Anxious not to seem like some ancient mystic trying to send my spirit up into the sky, I was very cagey about who I collaborated with. But I wasn't the only one who wanted to see if it could actually be done. Little by little, I assembled the necessary expertise and materials. Of course, all the way through, I was mindful that mainstream science was quite sure that conditions in the cloud layer were unsurvivable for Yihante. It was known that the further you got from the Earth, the colder it got, further confirming that the source of the temperature rise during the day lay beneath the Earth layer. Air density changed too. In other words, it seemed likely that the cloud layer was the final and most sparsely filled layer before the universe terminated into nothingness. These concerns posed challenges, but they were not insurmountable. Alongside the machine itself I developed, with the generous help of some of my engineering colleagues, a heated suit and a glass dome to place over my head that could keep fresh air from a tank flowing into my lung slits even in the event of total vacuum. All this was done in such secrecy that when the day finally came, there were scarcely a dozen people there to see me off, all of them fellow scholars. I gave a short speech I prepared on the necessity of pushing boundaries in the pursuit of science, and then I gave the command, "Inflate the balloon." As the newly isolated hydrogen gas flooded into the chambers and the building-sized balloon filled out, a real crowd started to gather. At first, they were just curious to see what the strange device was, science project or installation art. When word began to spread of the purpose of the balloon, the hubbub started. Some of it was derisive. Many people thought I was heading to my death, and I confess, I wasn't entirely sure they were wrong. But most of it was quite touchingly supportive. Without further ado, I climbed into the basket. I would have been grateful for someone to share the mission with, but assembling just one suit had been almost prohibitively expensive. I also didn't want to risk anyone else on my folly, and so it was alone that I cut the tether and ascended into the sky. I had set out just before dusk. My aim was to observe the dawn, and if it did turn out to be the result of some phenomenon like a lightning storm, I wanted to be able to descend before it reached me. For some reason I thought my ascent into the cloud layer would take several hours at least. In fact, the roiling clouds approached with alarming rapidity. I braced myself. I knew that I would likely be buffeted by strong winds once I left the open air. I could only hope that I would last long enough to take some meaningful measurements. At the very least, I'd had the good sense to choose a relatively calm day. Night had just fallen as I reached the cloud layer, and almost instantly visibility dropped to only a few meters. But the hydrogen balloon held strong and continued to carry me upwards. With nothing much to look at, I busied myself with the sample jars. Even if I failed to find the source of daylight, I wanted to come back with something to show for it. No one had taken samples from this deep in the cloud layer before, and I would make my scientific reputation on that alone. My air pressure monitor told me that the atmosphere was continuing to thin out, which likely meant I was still climbing. I had no idea how thick the cloud layer was. Both the air layer and the earth layer seemed to be only a few kilometers thick, and from earth layer to cloud layer had taken me only a few minutes. Would I soon reach a hitherto undiscovered layer? Or would I, as most of my fellow scientists predicted, reach the edge of the universe and find myself floating in nothingness? On an intellectual level, I knew that I only needed to release some of the hydrogen in the balloons to descend back to the Earth, but a small part of me feared that I would be lost, drifting in the darkness forever. And then, light. I couldn't understand what I was seeing at first. It was as if I was looking up at a ceiling fixed with thousands, no, millions, of small electric light bulbs. They gave off a faint but pure white light. Then I realized that this must be it. I had reached the layer that held the secret to the origin of daytime. I must have stared at them for hours before I even thought to take any notes, which meant taking off my gloves. Fortunately, it wasn't as deadly cold as I'd feared, although it certainly stung. I'd brought a telescope with me, and wherever I looked revealed that there were even more pinpricks of light than I could see with the naked eye. It was, well, awe-inspiring doesn't even begin to cover it. I used the telescope to mark the position of the brightest points of light I could see, taking reference of my own position with a compass. I tried to hypothesize what they might be, and how they were related to daylight, for despite the fact that they were shining bright above me, I knew it was the middle of the night. I carried on charting the position of the lights above me for hours, working feverishly to capture as much of the scene for posterity as I could. Dawn came, and I was not in the least bit prepared for it. I had expected that the pinpricks of light, stars as I chose to call them, would start glowing brighter as daytime approached. Instead, they seemed to dim, or at least the blackness around them got brighter, and to the east I saw rays of light breaking the horizon. I was very nearly blinded. As the great sphere of fire rose into view, I almost didn't tear my gaze away in time. I tried to peek at it a couple of times, but it was just too bright. In fact, it was almost too bright to see, even when I wasn't looking directly at it. I wasn't going to give up that easily, though. I pointed the telescope at it, and watching the light it cast on the floor of the basket, I was able to confirm that it was a perfect circle. The brightness was so all-consuming that I didn't register the heat at first. The temperature soon began to rise, however, and I could feel the burning sensation on the exposed skin on the back of my head. I might have tried to brave it a little longer, but I realized that every second I stayed, I risked igniting the hydrogen. Grudgingly, I opened the release valves and began my return back to the Earth. I did so knowing that once I made it back, nothing would ever be the same again. At that point I had only ideas and suppositions. I could not say for sure whether the lights I had seen had been small and only a few kilometers away, or vast and far, far distant. But it seemed logical to assume that my stars were the same kind of object as the day source, as I provisionally called it, with a similar luminosity tempered by distance, which would mean that they must at the very least be thousands of kilometers away, perhaps even millions. All this time we'd thought that the edge of the universe was only a few dozen kilometers above our heads. I landed half dead in a farmer's field 50 kilometers from where I started, and already impatient to go back up. It took a week of recovery in the infirmary before I could even walk unaided, and a month for my vision to return to normal. But go back up I did. They would have had to lock me up to stop me. Soon others followed, and before long everything I had seen was confirmed, and that was only the beginning of our discoveries. So that is the story of how our understanding of the universe changed forever, and how I became the first astronomer.